Hey, okay, technical difficulties and we're back. So I'm going to show you what I'm doing in my garden to prepare some ground for some garden beds that I'm going to create next year. So I'm going to turn the camera around. Okay, so here's kind of like the back 40 of my garden. I've got my chicken coop and we got a whole bunch of weeds that are super tall. But also there's some thistle in there, but there's also some kind of like other late flowering plants that I'm going to leave just for the bees. It's kind of a mess, but that's how it goes. If you watch these, you know that we use straw. We don't use straw in my garden for mulch, we use leaves. And so these are some bags of leaves that we collected last fall. You can kind of see they're weathered. Some of them are kind of falling apart. But I laid these bags of leaves over this part of the garden that was just super weedy to kind of smother the weeds. So here we go. Let's kind of so we got some cool season annual weeds popping up around the edges. So this right here, let's see, where's my hand? Right here, where you can see my finger. This is the beginning of dead nettle, which is a flower in the springtime. It's a purple flower. Henbit is a very similar weed, but I can tell by the leaves that this is dead nettle. Anyway, so that's starting to germinate. I also got some honeyvine milkweed, some Asiatic dayflower, and that's about all I see right now. Oh, hi kitty. And this is Lexi, the garden cat. Anyway, I digress. So what I'm doing with these bags of leaves is I'm smothering the vegetation below. So that would be the first step in preparing your ground for a garden next spring, is kill the existing vegetation. Preferably, I do it without any chemical sprays or without tilling, if you can. Not all pre-existing vegetation will die without tillage or maybe possibly some chemical applications, but I prefer the no-till smothering method, as you can see. So I've been smothering the vegetation under here for several weeks now, and you can see I ran out of bags of leaves. So I have kind of this uncovered part in my garden. So what I'm going to do is I have my own personal favorite place to get cardboard. So I went and got some cardboard at Walt's bike shop over the weekend, because bikes come in big boxes, which is nice. I don't think a bike came in this box because it's not super big. But anyway, smother vegetation. So I put things on top of the vegetation, preferably like cardboard or paper, because it will decompose over the winter time and it just kind of works into the soil, so it's perfect. Another thing to do is add compost. I already previously planted cover crops in this bed, so I'm not going to add compost because the cover crops will kind of add the soil nutrition that I'm going for. But I would add compost. You can add it under the box, so I would weed whack or whatever, the weeds or grass or whatever it is, pretty low. Mine is already pretty low, so I'm not going to do anything. Add some compost, which if this is like a virgin ground, I would definitely recommend. Like I said, these had some cover crops on them, so I'm not going to do that. Then add your smothering material. I'm doing this all by myself, so with the filming and everything, so I would be giving you a better demonstration, but I think you get it. So then you put the cardboard down, and then on top of the cardboard you just add your mulch. So in my case, that's going to be leaves, but straw is really common. Those are probably the two most common. Grass clippings are pretty common if you don't have Bermuda grass in your yard, which some people don't. And then just let that set all winter. You want the mulch to be thick enough that you can't see the cardboard at all, because the whole thing's going to kind of decompose over time. I'm going to flip the camera back around. So the whole thing's going to decompose over the winter time. So you want to make sure that mulch layer is really thick. Then in the spring, March, April, whenever you want to build your raised bed, rake that mulch away, and then build your raised bed around that. Add your topsoil and compost, your soil amendments, and then you can have your raised bed garden. And you will have prepared the kind of native soil much better. It'll be looser, it'll be free of weeds or grass or whatever, and then you'll be ready to go. Good question. All right, let's move on to another question. Second question. What should I do to winterize all my outdoor plants, like herbs, etc.? Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer. It depends on what kind of plants we're talking about. So there's like annual plants that just live one season. There's perennial plants that live multiple seasons. There's biennial plants which live 2 seasons, and then there's tender perennials, which in the environment that they come from natively are perennial plants, but due to our climate here and our growing conditions should be treated like annuals. So it really depends on the type of herbs you're talking about. So the kind of major annuals or tender perennials that we have here are basil, cilantro, let me think. Those are kind of the 2 really big ones that I can think of. So those are going to die with the first frost. So I would just pull those out after they die. Herbs that are perennials like oregano, chives, sage, marjoram, tarragon, all of those would live over the winter time. So you don't have to do really anything to them, just add some mulch around them to protect their roots a little bit from, the moisture or the cold, maybe dry air of wintertime. A lot of your plants, like a lot of your vegetables, are going to be annuals. So once the first killing frost comes, I would either pull them out and then compost them, or something you can do, which would be great for the insect population, is just to leave them over the wintertime, because there are there are like overwintering sites for a lot of things, pests definitely, but also, ladybugs and green lacewings and even bats and turtles, and it's like, it's a habitat. So I'm going to turn the camera around. So right here we have some asparagus, which may be kind of hard to tell. This is asparagus. So for overwintering this, it will, at some point in the winter, usually around November, it will turn brown. You cut the brown tops off to protect the roots from getting too cold, and then you add compost and straw to it. What we do sometimes at the Veterans Urban Farm, where we have asparagus growing, is we'll cut the ferny part of the asparagus, and then we'll just set it somewhere else on the property, so that anything that's overwintering in this plant matter can still live and exist. And then but then we still have a nice tidy asparagus bed that's composted and well mulched and ready for in preparation for harvesting next spring. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. So over here, the classic annuals is the tomatoes. Those will definitely die with the first killing frost. So again, you can either pull them out after they die, or leave them for a little bit just to allow that habitat. We got some kale that will live a little bit past the first killing frost, but probably won't live all the way through winter, most winters. And then kind of, goes chard, less winter hardy. I've actually already winterized this whole section of my garden. It had a pumpkin in it, one pumpkin plant, that was pretty big. It pretty much took up almost all of this leafed area. But it was dying. You can kind of see a couple pumpkins that are mostly eaten by squirrels. I got no pumpkins because the squirrels ate them all. And I ended up just composting that pumpkin plant because it wasn't going to make any more pumpkins before the frost, and I just didn't think it needed to be there anymore, so I just tossed it in the back of our garden. So I don't know, that was kind of a rambling answer, but it really depends on the cold hardiness of the plants you're trying to overwinter. So I would look into, I would do some Google searches for what plants you have and what plants you want to overwinter. Okay, so now we're going to talk about tomatoes. Let's do another question. What should I do if I still have green tomatoes right now? Is it too late for them to turn before winter? That's a good question. So this is my tomato patch. I think I've got like 14 plants. There's some peppers in here too. So I hope, can you tell? I have lots of green tomatoes still. Now that the nights are getting cooler and there's just a lot of dew, the plants aren't super happy, and the tomatoes, like the fruit, is getting a little bit smaller. But they're still ripening. Like we got a good one ripening over here that I'll harvest later. So yes, they'll continue ripening. So just my kind of strategy with my tomatoes is to pick them kind of at like this stage of ripeness. So like still kind of green, not totally deep red. And that's just to keep, you know, the insect and squirrel damage off them. And then I let them ripen on my countertop all the way before I use them. And that's really important, doing it on the countertop, because I don't know, refrigeration makes the consistency of your tomatoes weird. So just don't refrigerate your tomatoes is one thing to never do. But that's a little off topic. Oh yeah, we're talking about... So anyway, so they'll still ripen. When you start watching the weather, you know, as we get into October and things like that, and when the night before you know, or you assume that the first killing frost is going to happen, I'd go out and pick all of the tomatoes you got on your plant that you want to. So if like you have like big slicing tomatoes, like, and you don't want little tomatoes, like don't pick like the ones that are this big, but pick all of the good sized green tomatoes and still put them on your counter. And what can happen is they can ripen like being picked totally green on your counter. I will, in my experience, say that the texture is different, and the flavor is a little different, but if you're like cooking them in chili or something, I mean, I'm no chef or like food critic, but I think it tastes just fine. But you have to do it before the first killing frost, because if a frost hits the fruit, it will burst the cell walls of the plant, and it like kind of makes the fruit like almost translucent, and you've lost it. You can't get that back. So definitely time it. Harvest them as normal until, you know, you see that it's going to drop down to 30, 31, 32 or below, and then harvest everything, put them on your counter. Let's move on. I am having issues with deer eating the last of my garden. What can I do to keep them at bay? It's a tough question. A lot of people have deer in their backyards. So, okay. You have two options, really, and like really have one option, is to put a fence on, or put a fence around the garden. So let's try. You can kind of see my fence. You can't see my, I don't know, you can't see my hand. So wait, I don't know how to use a camera. So this is, you can't tell at all. This is my deer fence. It is, I don't know, like 7 or 8 feet tall. And it's totally covered with, you know, this Virginia creeper, and actually I'm looking at some poison ivy right here, and there's trees growing up in it. But anyway, so it's tall. You can kind of see some of the fence kind of like in front of me, where the Virginia creeper is not super thick. And that goes all the way around my garden. So that's tall enough so that the deer can't vertically jump it. And that's really worked pretty well for us. I'm trying to turn the camera around because I think you get it. So vertical fence. It's a big expense. Lots of time to install. So there's that. You could do a horizontal fence, so deer can jump very high, like woo, but they can't jump far. So you can do a lower fence that's made of like 2 strings or 2 like runs of fence that are a few feet apart, like 3 or 4 feet apart, and they cannot jump over that. They jump high, they don't jump wide. A lot of people, in my experience, a lot of people don't choose that route because they don't have the space to devote, you know, a 4-foot wide perimeter fence around the whole thing. But that will keep deer out, and it's actually a lot more cost effective than a tall fence. It's a lot less materials. because it really just has to be a string. It doesn't have to be, you know, like a chain link fence, 2 chain link fences next to each other. So what a deer will, I guess a deer will like look at it and be like, oh, I can't like make it, I can't fit into that space in between the fence, so I'm not even going to try. So that one works as well. If this problem with deer is a new issue, and you don't have this like established like population in your neighborhood or whatever, you can use deer repellent, and you can get that at like a hardware store or whatever. They have like different ones, but essentially like the deer don't like the smell or they don't like the taste of it, and it'll just keep them at bay. Oftentimes they say repellents don't work because you know, the critter you're trying to repel will ultimately realize like, oh, either I can develop a taste for this, or, you know, I don't like the smell of this, but like I realize that nothing bad is going to happen to me just because I don't like the smell, and so they'll still do their thing. So a fence is really, it's really kind of at the end of the day your best option for deer. It's kind of a more long-term option though. So let's go to another question. Is it worth starting compost this time of year? Always. It's always worthwhile starting compost. You know, like, I don't know the statistic, but, you know, somewhere between like a quarter to a third of all of the stuff we throw away can decompose. And so, like, just for that fact alone, I personally am like, you should always just compost, just to keep it out of the landfill. It is really hard on a residential scale to make compost because it's like a volume and mass thing for temperature purposes. But, you know, it's good to have no matter what. So, yeah, start a compost. What I do at my house is I've got an ice cream bucket on my counter. I throw food scraps in the ice cream bucket. Out my back door I have a 5-gallon bucket. I throw the stuff from the ice cream bucket into the 5-gallon bucket. When the 5-gallon bucket's full, I walk it all the way. Oh, I keep doing this. I forget that I have it like on selfie. I walk it all the way to the back of my garden, past like my back 40, past all these weeds, you can't see it, past the chicken coop, and I have a pile in the back corner of my garden. And that's just where I toss my food scraps. It doesn't really make compost because I'm just a single family, and you know, it doesn't, so it's kind of back there. So it doesn't break down perfectly, but it's always worth it to start a compost pile. Moving on with the compost question. Is it worth, wait, I already answered that question. What should I do with my outdoor compost this winter? Well, that's a great question. If it's a compost pile that's like how I would call it cooking, like you're actively making compost, I would say nothing, you know, just keep doing what you're doing. If it's finished compost, I would say add it to your garden bed this fall, because nitrogen in the finished compost will leach out, and so you might as well just like have it leach into your garden soil instead of just wherever your compost is. So if it's finished, add it to your garden as part of your winterizing routine. If it's not finished and you're still adding to it, just, you know, do what you're doing. So I'm not sure what this plant is. It's a volunteer, but it's some sort of cucurbit, but it's got no fruit. I have no idea what it is, but I almost pulled it because it's providing maybe too much shade to my overwintered carrots, but I didn't, and I don't know if I think I'm picking this up. It's a late blooming thing, so the honeybees and bumblebees, and even, you know, like I see some cucumber beetles, I see a wasp, they're all over right now, so I just have to keep it. I don't know what it is, but it's got white flowers, which is kind of unusual for a cucurbit. But can you see this? This is like got this little honeybee up here, and it's got like pollen in its basket. It's a little blurry, but you can see it, I think. Anyway, so on the north side of this trellis of whatever volunteer this is, I have my carrots that I'm planning on harvesting next spring. So I'll keep you updated on that. And the reason why I planted those on the north side is because carrots need, like, it was too hot when I started the carrots in the ground. So this volunteer cucurbit provided the shade that these carrots needed to germinate, so it kind of worked out perfectly. Carrots don't need the shade anymore, but the bees need the pollen, so, and the nectar, so we're keeping it until it dies with the first frost. Can you see that bee? Yeah, they're everywhere. It's really fun. Anyway, let's keep answering some questions. When can I plant garlic and onions in the fall? That's a great question. I'm actually allergic to garlic, so that's like the main garden vegetable that I do not plant in my garden. But it's really easy to remember when to plant it because, or at least for me, you plant it right around Halloween, so late October, early November. You can order it online right now. I would not buy garlic from the grocery store and plant that. Don't do that. Get seed garlic from a seed source, like Johnny's Seeds or Peaceful Valley or something like that. And then you break the bulbs up. They come just like you buy them in the grocery store, like in garlic bulbs. You break the bulbs up and you plant the individual cloves, and then you mulch that, and next spring they'll pop out of the ground, and next summer you'll have garlic to harvest. Onions, you can overwinter onions here. They're a little trickier, and I have found they're not as easy to find as like garlic is. Because you kind of have to either start the seed for the fall onions or the overwintered onions, and we're well past that time frame, or you have to find little like sets or slips, which are like tiny onions, which are hard to find at this time of year. So if you find some overwinter onions for zone 6A, purchase them online, but it's definitely not the easiest, and not all onion varieties overwinter. So that's definitely not like beginner gardening, like garlic is. Overwintered onions are a little more challenging. So if this is your first time overwintering anything, I would suggest garlic instead of onions. Okay. Now green onions, I'm sorry, before I move on, green onions are super easy to overwinter. Again, it's hard to find the seed, or it's almost too late to plant the seed, but it's kind of hard to find the things to plant right now. But if you find like little sets for green onions, those are super easy to overwinter. But bulb onions, much more difficult. All right, moving on. One more question, and I'll kind of continue walking around the garden because I've got not many demonstrations to show. Can you also talk about different organic products you use? Is it possible to get us a list? Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So I just have like some things that I jotted down. As far as like things that we use, this is my favorite summer and winter squash plant. It's a rapicante. This is totally off topic, sorry, but it's just a magnificent plant. It's huge. This is 2 plants. It's like over a 20-foot long bed for 2 plants. Pretty nice. Here's my overwintered kale. I just planted my spinach and I'm shading it. Hopefully it'll germinate later this week. Here are my scallions that I'm going to overwinter. It's kind of a little overwintered patch of my garden. Sorry, I digress. So we use a lot of diatomaceous earth. You can get that at Westlake's. You can get it probably at like Lowe's and stuff too, but it's certified organic, or you can get certified organic diatomaceous earth. And we use that in our greenhouse because we use compost in the soil blocks that we make. And so we use it to keep like ants and roly-polies and centipedes and stuff from killing our young seedlings. So diatomaceous earth is pretty important. We also mix it with water and we'll spray it on brassicas like bok choy that get a lot of flea beetles. And so the diatomaceous earth will kind of keep the flea beetles at bay. The really only other thing we use that we apply for insects is BT, and we get a certified organic brand called Dipel that you mix with water and you spray it on. We mostly use it on brassicas like kale and collards, but some people use it on tomatoes too because of tomato hornworms, and that's a naturally occurring bacteria that kills caterpillars. And kale and collards, if you're a gardener, you know, like, are just decimated by caterpillars. Those are kind of like the things we use for insects, that we apply for insects. Other things we use for insects, probably more predominantly than either of those, things, is insect netting. So insect netting is like tulle. If you drive by the ag park or if you drive by the Veterans Urban Farm, you will certainly see it because we have a lot of it in play right now and almost always throughout the season. And it's just a white net that we have elevated over the garden beds, and it physically keeps butterflies, moths, other insects away from the plants. So we use that extensively. So insect netting is something we really, really like to use, and it's obviously certified organic. Another thing we use is row cover. So it's like insect netting in that you drape it over your plants, but it is more like a sheet, and it still lets sunlight in, but it one is a physical barrier against insects, but also keeps things a little bit warmer, which we use at the kind of the beginning and the end of the season. We use a lot of cover crops to amend the soil, build soil health, kind of smother weeds. We use a lot of mulch. We use a lot of herbicide-free straw that we get from Jamestown, Missouri, to smother weeds, protect the soil. We do use fertilizer and soil amendments, all certified organic amendments, but what we do is definitely not, at the ag park and the Veterans Urban Farm, is definitely not transferable to a backyard gardener. So I'm not going to recommend that you do the same fertilizing scheme that we do, because it's very, it requires, expensive soil tests, which soil tests are great, but in very like precise quantities of pretty like obscure amendments, so it's not easy. So for a home gardener, what I would suggest, is definitely compost. Cover crops, they aren't the easiest either, but if you can get into a habit of using cover crops, that would definitely benefit your soil. And then just a general organic all-purpose garden fertilizer as needed. And there's companies that sell that online. So those are kind of what we use, and then a recommendation of what you can use in lieu of, the fertilizing regimen that we have, because it's so complicated. And actually, I think that was the last question. Well, thanks for joining me in my garden this morning and listening to me answer some of your questions about gardening. As always, if you have questions that we can answer, please shoot them to us in an email or via social media, and next Monday we'll answer them. Have a great week, and if you haven't already, it's the perfect time to plant your overwintered spinach. So if you have questions about how to do that, contact us, and we'd love to share information with you. Take care. Bye.